Good morning, friends. A warm cup of water is always a kind way to start the day. Go ahead, take a sip. Now tell me, what would you do if your late husband's mum took your grieving son's only joy and threatened to break it? Let me walk you through one of the most heartbreaking toxic mother-in-law stories I've ever heard. A tale of love, grief, and betrayal inside the family. You see, not every toxic mother-in-law starts out that way. In fact, this story begins with something many of us understand all too well: grief. A young woman lost her husband far too early, when their son was just 3 years old. Her mother-in-law, her husband's mother, stepped in like a guardian angel, not the controlling narcissistic type you might hear about in those crazy MIL stories, but the kind that shows up, makes meals, helps with laundry, listens when you cry, and actually puts you first, even while grieving her own child. And in those first few years, she was more than family. She was a lifeline. Now, pause with me here. If you've ever leaned on someone during a storm, someone who didn't have to be there but chose to, then you understand how deep that kind of bond can go. It's the kind of relationship that makes betrayal hurt 10 times more, because somewhere along the line, she changed. Not overnight, but gradually. Like a storm rolling in slowly from the horizon. Little comments here, a controlling tone there. At first, this woman, the daughter-in-law, brushed it off. She thought maybe it was just stress, or maybe her mother-in-law was feeling lonely as her grandson grew up. Maybe it was grief, still tangled inside her, unspoken, unprocessed. After all, she had never gone to counseling. But things kept shifting. Her son, now a teenager, had grown into a kind, thoughtful young man. He adored books, wasn't glued to video games or TikTok like other kids. No loot boxes, no microtransactions, just stories. He even wanted to be a writer one day, so for his birthday, his mum gave him a reading tablet, not a toy, not a distraction, but something to nurture his passion. But here's where the husband-mum drama begins to brew. The grandmother hated that device. She saw her grandson reading and immediately assumed screen equals bad. No matter how many times they told her it was for books, she'd snap, complain, even accuse. Until one day, she crossed a line. She took the tablet right out of his hands and threatened to break it. That's not discipline. That's destruction. Some folks might say, she's just old-fashioned, or she means well. But there's a fine line between caring and controlling. And when someone takes away a child's joy, especially when that child has already lost a father, it's not just about a tablet anymore. It's about trust and respect. So here's my question to you. When does helpful turn into harmful? Is there a point where a once loving mother-in-law becomes a toxic influence? And would you do if someone who used to be your lifeline started becoming the storm? Let's talk about it. So, let's go back to that afternoon, the one that changed everything. The son had just finished his homework, a good student, responsible. He sat quietly in his grandmother's living room, completely absorbed in To Kill a Mockingbird. And no, he wasn't scrolling social media or playing those shady mobile games with loot boxes. He was reading, on the same tablet his mom had gifted him, the one filled with libraries worth of books. Then she walked in. His grandmother, the same woman who once rocked him to sleep, stood over him and demanded he put it down. When he hesitated, because what harm is there in reading a schoolbook, she snatched it from his hands. Now, let's pause there for a second. If you're a grandparent listening right now, let me ask you, would you ever take something away from your grandchild that clearly brings them joy, especially something educational, especially when they're not doing anything wrong? But this wasn't just about a tablet. This was about control. This is where we step into classic toxic family dynamics. When someone tries to reassert authority by force, not care, not conversation, but power, that's when things stop being about raising the child right and start becoming a toxic mother-in-law story in the making. By the time the boy's mum arrived, he was on the verge of tears. His grandmother had not only taken his tablet, she was threatening to break it, over a book. And instead of backing down, the mother-in-law turned her frustration toward the daughter-in-law. she accused her of being a bad parent, said the boy's brain was being rotted by too much screen time, and that he wasn't allowed to use it in her home ever again. Now let's be real. If this were just about screen time, there's a conversation to be had. We've all debated how much is too much, but this wasn't a two-sided discussion. It was an ambush. And in that moment, the mother had to make a decision. She could try to reason with someone who clearly wasn't listening, or she could protect her son's peace. And she did just that. She calmly said, "Okay, he won't be coming to your house anymore," and walked out with her child and the tablet. Now that is what setting a boundary looks like. But of course, the drama didn't end there. Over the weekend, the MIL bombarded her with calls and messages, accusing her of keeping the last piece of her son away. A classic narcissistic mother-in-law guilt trip. Here's where it gets complicated. The mum never said her son couldn't see his grandmother. She only said he wouldn't be going to her house. But now, the son himself doesn't want to see her at all, and who could blame him? So, let's ask the hard question today. When does protecting your child mean limiting their relationship with your family? Is there ever a way back from that kind of train? Family betrayal? Drop your thoughts below, because this is the kind of relationship drama no one warns you about, but too many of us end up facing. Let me ask you something real today. What happens when grief goes unspoken and turns into control? Can love, once so pure, slowly morph into something toxic and no one notices until it's too late? Because here's what makes this story harder than your usual crazy Mayal Cell stories. It didn't start with drama, it started with loss. The grandmother in this story, she once was a true rock. When her son died unexpectedly, she didn't collapse, she stepped in. She supported her daughter-in-law like her own. She put the needs of a grieving young mother and child ahead of her own pain. That's rare, that's powerful. But grief has its shadows. And if it's never processed, never spoken, it doesn't disappear, it festers. As the boy grew, he began to look more and more like his father. Same eyes, same smile, maybe even the same mannerisms. And to the grandmother, that might have been comforting or unbearable. Here's the thing many toxic family Reddit stories miss. Not all toxic behavior comes from a place of malice. Sometimes it comes from pain, deep, unresolved pain. That doesn't excuse it, but it does explain why people change. The mother suspects her Mael never went to grief counseling. And that might have been the turning point. The woman who once uplifted her now shames her. The one who once soothed her son now threatens to break his possessions. The same Mael who once said, "We're family," now calls her a bad mother. Is this just narcissistic mother-in-law energy? Or is this grief twisted into something sharp? Now, this mum has had to face a question so many parents deal with in relationship drama podcast stories. How do you balance empathy with protection? Can you feel sorry for someone and still keep them at a distance? Because while she sees the pain in her Mayal's eyes, she also sees the fear in her son's. That boy, who once looked forward to spending afternoons at grandma's, now chooses to stay away, not out of defiance, but out of discomfort, maybe even hurt. And can we blame him? As parents and grandparents, we always say we want the best for our children. But sometimes, what a child needs isn't more lessons. It's safety, respect, peace. It's why so many people in justnomil podcast discussions say, sometimes you don't go no contact out of anger. You do it out of necessity. This mum didn't ban her Mael. She didn't block visits. All she said was, "Not in your house." That's a boundary, a clear, respectful one. But the Mael sees it as betrayal, which leads to the real question we all need to ask ourselves. Can a family survive when boundaries feel like rejection? What do you do when healing requires distance? And the other person refuses to see that? Let's talk about it. There's often just a wounded heart, colliding with a protective one. Let me ask you this. What happens when the child, once quiet and dependent, starts making choices for himself? At what point do we stop speaking for our children and start listening to them. Because in this story, the most powerful shift didn't come from the mother or the grandmother. It came from the son. This 14-year-old boy, who had once been so close to his grandmother, made a quiet, powerful choice. I don't want to see her right now. No drama, no yelling, just a clear boundary, one rooted in experience, not rebellion. And honestly, that's where this family betrayal podcast story gets deeper, because this isn't just about a toxic mother-in-law anymore. It's about a boy growing into himself, shaped by the love, loss, and tension around him. He adored his reading tablet, not because it was flashy, not because it had games, but because it held stories, worlds where he could explore, dream, and maybe even process his own grief. This was a kid who wanted to be an author, a boy who had already won awards for his writing, and yet his grandmother saw that device as a threat, not a bridge. That moment, when she snatched it from his hands and threatened to break it, wasn't just about screen time. It was about control, about disrespecting what mattered to him. It's a recurring pattern we see in so many wife versus mother-in-law stories. Elders dismissing the inner worlds of younger generations because it doesn't match their version of acceptable. But here's the twist. Today's kids, they're emotionally aware. They recognize passive aggression. They pick up on guilt trips. They know when they're not respected. And more importantly, they're starting to speak up. This young man didn't ask his mum to cut off his grandmother. He didn't demand revenge. He simply said, "Not right now." And in doing so, he reminded all of us of something critical. Kids grow up, and when they do, they start setting boundaries too. That's not disrespect. That's maturity. In so many crazy Mal stories, the focus is on the clash between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. But maybe we need to widen the lens, because sometimes the real drama isn't between the adults, it's the fallout that lands on the next generation. This mom did something powerful. She didn't pressure her son to forgive and forget. She honored his voice, respected his space. That's good parenting. That's what breaks cycles. Now here's the question for you. What would you do if your child asked for space from your parent? Would you respect it, even if it hurt you? Or would you push back, trying to keep the peace? In stories like these, from narcissistic mother-in-law meltdowns to true revenge stories, there's always a turning point. And sometimes, that turning point comes from the youngest voice in the room. Here's something worth asking out loud. How long should we stay silent before it starts costing us something? Not just our peace, but our relationships, our dignity, our family's future. For years, the mother in this story had been the peacekeeper. She stayed quiet. She took the high road, even when her toxic mother-in-law twisted small things into major dramas. Even when her narcissistic behavior made family events feel more like war zones than warm gatherings. But silence, my friends, has a price. It's easy to label these stories as just crazy Mills stories or relationship drama podcasts fodder. But behind every crazy act, there's someone who has been tolerating it far too long, telling themselves it'll get better, that maybe they're overreacting. The real turning point came quietly. No yelling, no public showdown, no screaming match at Thanksgiving. It was a calm conversation between a mother and her son. He had drawn a line. She respected it. And together they chose peace, even if it meant distance from someone who once felt like family. The grandmother did try to spin the narrative. Of course she did. She sent guilt-filled texts. She tried roping in other family members to mediate. She told people that her grandson was being turned against her. Classic signs of emotional manipulation. It's something we see often in family betrayal podcasts and toxic family Reddit tales, where the offender paints themselves as the victim the moment they lose control. But this time, no one took the bait, because this wasn't about punishment. It wasn't revenge. It was about protection. Sometimes, protecting your peace means disappointing people who are used to manipulating you. And that's exactly what this mom did, not just for herself, but for her son. She didn't burn bridges. She simply stopped letting someone else light the match. In a way, this is one of those true revenge stories, not with anger, but with clarity, with boundaries, with love that says, enough is enough. So here we are, years later. The boy is now thriving. He still writes. He's still passionate about stories. But more importantly, he's surrounded by people who see him, who respect his boundaries, who lift him up, not tear him down. As for the mother, she may have lost a relationship with her mother-in-law, but what she gained was far greater: a stronger bond with her child, a sense of peace, and the freedom to move forward without constant emotional chaos. Now, before we wrap this episode, let's make this real simple. If this story reminded you of someone in your life, just drop a character in the comments. No need to explain. No need to share more than you're ready for. Just a single heart. That's it. It tells us, yeah, I've been there too. And trust me, you are not alone. If you made it this far, thank you. Really. This podcast is a space where we talk through the hard stuff together. And if you want more stories about toxic mother-in-laws, family betrayals, or relationship drama that twists when you least expect it, hit that subscribe, give this episode a thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care of yourself and each other.